while back, I got recommended this video by the YouTube channel Solar Pellets titled Unremarkable and Odd Places in Dark Souls. It's an hour and a half, mostly unscripted video of Solar Pellets, if that even is their real name, going over certain in-game spaces in the first Dark Souls that they find, as the title quite openly puts it, unremarkable and odd. The 90 or so minutes that followed was also exactly just that. A completely straightforward showcase of these unremarkable and odd places.
I really don't know how to explain it, to be honest. It's just an odd, unremarkable spot that you can be in for no reason. And I like that. I think there's something special about spots like this in video games.
She covered locations ranging from the little ledges sticking out from underneath the ruins of Firling Shrine, a tiny platform sticking out beneath the stairs leading up to the Taurus demon boss, which they briskly slide onto, the Titanite demon-infested bottom part of Sen's Fortress, among many, many more places. The moment I saw the video recommended to me, the honest first reaction I had was one of understanding. Of course, I thought. The video felt to me like a necessity. How hasn't this video existed before this? It's too obvious. The reason, of course, is something most people who've played Dark Souls would probably relate to. I too have felt this oddness, or whatever it is that this video seems to render explicit. In fact, the bridge between Undead Parish and Sen's Fortress is probably my personal favorite space in any video game of all time. It too is painfully ordinary, unremarkable. It's a bridge built for the player to access Sen's Fortress from the bonfire. It, by itself, holds absolutely no importance to the larger scope of the game and might as well be replaced or cut. But something about it, the utter banality of the low-quality trees surrounding it, the darkness that seems to occupy the floor of the forest, put there to obscure the lack of a floor, and also the rushing water texture placed in that darkness, signifying the existence of a river that we never get to see or even know of again, and the ambient sound of the wind and the splashing of the rushing water beneath all culminate to form this overall atmosphere that just gets a hold over me. While most would probably trudge through without a second thought over the course of the game, I've spent minutes just looking at the place, taking in the eeriness that it possesses, even though it makes no sense why it would. I've seen that place in my dreams, even though it makes no sense why I would. There's nothing about it, nothing that should be eerie or scary. Considering the rest of the contents of the game, the thought of slowly losing your mind because of your inability to die, the burning out of the primordial flame, bringing about the cold and the dark, the end of the world, and you being there to witness the atrocities that such a world has spawned, this little crumbling bridge and the developer's tricks to maintain an illusion of a forest should be the last thing that should fill me with anxiety and dread, and yet it isn't. And by and large, Solar Pellets also touches upon this evasive aura that a bunch of other spaces in Dark Souls possesses, and their evasiveness is noticeable in how her attempts at describing or defining this feeling often trails off into I don't knows or other sentences that are vague and ambiguous.
I came over here. On my way back, I noticed this cliff. And for some reason, this cliff specifically gives me that strange feeling in a way that I don't even know how to describe the feeling itself. It's just weird. It feels like I should be able to climb up there. Not necessarily in the game, but it feels like I should be out there in real life. It's that nostalgia despite never being there. I've never noticed this cliff before in all of my time playing Dark Souls, but the more I look at it, the more nostalgic it feels.
And obviously, looking at what I just said about the bridge, yeah, I could not really put it into words either. It's very difficult to pinpoint what is so bizarre about these places. These are certainly reminiscent of the liminal spaces phenomenon that took the internet by storm a couple of months ago, as most of these places too share the same qualities as those liminal space photos. They're usually void of any life, or here in the case of video games, they lack NPCs or any interactable objects. They have a heavy and surreal atmosphere, almost dreamlike. They often leave you feeling vulnerable because of how they're shot, or in the case of video games, because of how out of game they feel. But nonetheless, these unremarkable and odd places, which I'll be calling odd places from now on, are distinct from liminal spaces in general in a couple of ways. One of them being that they're almost inherent to video games. In fact, the Solar Pellets video opens with her mentioning another creator named Annie Austin, who has made around 20 videos that feature more of these odd places in many different video games varying in genre and style. Mario 64, Assassin's Creed, Tears of the Kingdom, Skyrim, and so on. And that's kind of an interesting fact, isn't it? These are wildly different games from different eras with different art styles and game mechanics, and yet all of them are littered with these odd places. And to look at the reason why requires us to adopt a metatextual lens. As Solar Pellets themselves state at the scripted part of their video, these spaces are less of a result of artistic design and more of a result of necessity and chance.
When you're designing a video game, though, you generally want to place things in locations that the player will discover and find naturally. You wouldn't place an enemy or important item in a corner out of the way of the player. As such, corners tend to be empty in video games, both literal corners at the meeting of two walls, but also corners of the game world, the places between, that merely exist because two things were placed with some distance between them.
Making video games is indeed a highly labor-inducive task. As such, it isn't too much of a shock when you pay less attention to the parts of your game that you know the players won't really be paying much attention to themselves. These are usually places in video games that are liminal, or in other words, act as a transition stage between two places. Take for instance this room where you get off the roller coaster thing in the latter half of the castle section in Resident Evil 4. It's a totally empty room. Of course, it does have a couple of vases that you can break, but other than that, there is nothing to this area. The entire purpose of it is simply to act as a place for you to get off the roller coaster and maybe stand around to manage your inventory and leave, never to think of the place ever again. I think it's kind of cool for that very reason. Diving a bit into some pretentious old Hegelian jargon, these spaces remind me of what Hegel stumbles upon in the science of logic called the finite. Of course, the logic has absolutely nothing directly to do with video games or liminal spaces, but if you're aware of Hegelian philosophy, you'd probably be accustomed to how it weirdly seems to seep into most things once you begin to look for it. Anyways, the finite is something whose being is itself a non-being. In other words, its being lies in its other, or its negation. Or, in even clearer terms, its death is coded into its birth, its end to its beginning. The finite, that which is destined to finish. And when it comes to these liminal spaces, especially in the case of video games, we find a potent parallel. Firstly, liminality itself implies a sense of finitude or temporariness. An elevator, a set of stairs, or a long hallway aren't spaces that you spend most of your time in. Similarly, nor are boss rooms after you beat the boss, or the meeting of green grassy land and the towering walls that you can only stare at from the top of the walls but not actually access. They possess a fleeting existence as far as we, the player, are concerned. Secondly, if most video game design is intended to be viewed or experienced, their very being, their essence, or their very existence is dependent on the player perceiving them. But, as said before, the purpose or the being of these odd places are the very opposite, and that is to be ignored by the player. Their fleeting existence is intended, hence why they're minimal in decor and design. They're filled in rather hastily because the developers reckon that players probably won't spend too much time poking around, as hopefully they will be too immersed in the actual intended content of the game to care. However, this is where the Hegelian movement actually begins to blow my mind. You see, following Hegel's thought process, unlike what conventional logic dictates, the finite does not really pass into a complete ending or utter nothingness. It does not really finish. Instead, the perishing of the finite perishes. The ending ends. The finishing finishes. And by doing so, it passes over into the infinite. Applying that pile of gibberish into video games, we come upon a very simple but surprisingly true proposition. Basically, the very reason for why these places have this odd or strange aura is not despite the fact of their accidental nature or unremarkability, but because of it. It is odd that a video game containing a dragon with a teethy gape running down its belly and an amalgam of skeletons held together with a dark aura as challenging boss fights also has this weirdly shaped little enclosure that makes no architectural or practical sense. Like, why the hell is it shaped like a banana? Where does that narrow passage lead to? Why is there nothing in here? Thus, in a rather paradoxical fashion, the very act of trying to be efficient with the resources available and designating them according to what you may think people will pay attention to leads people paying more attention to the very places you would have originally guessed to have been uninteresting. That is why these videos pop up and why the comments always seem to relate to them. Now, that's not to say, however, that all of these odd places are unplanned and accidental. Recently, I finished playing the first installment of No More Heroes, a 2007 brawler that follows the rather bizarre journey of Travis Touchdown as he does chores around a city, jacks off his lightsaber sword thing, and commits absolute bloodshed on his way to becoming the #1 assassin of the UAA, the United Assassins Association. The combat is addictive, the story is very amusing, and the game itself is rather compact, so if you have a few hours to burn, consider checking it out. If, by any chance, you weren't aware of the game, but found the visual style familiar, that's because No More Heroes is the brainchild of the rather critically acclaimed Killer 7's creator, Goichi Suda, or more popularly known as Suda51. Now, Suda is known for his weird and rough-looking games with a hint of punk and grunge. There is a lot of blood, mutilation, and steam, I guess. However, the reason I bring up the game is because of the fact that No More Heroes' city, named Santa Destroy, is basically a huge, unremarkable, and odd place. Although the city is populated with NPC cars and random civilian models, and although there are interactable NPCs positioned in a few corners of the map, by and large, traveling through the place with Travis's kind of choppy bike feels dreamlike. Travis's motel, the baseball stadium that you make a visit to for 2 of the 10 main assassin battles, the subway station, hell, the canal at the back of the No More Heroes motel, all possess this emptiness that refuses to leave you. There is something so mesmerizing about the harsh daylight tones that cover the city for the entirety of the game. This especially goes for boss arenas right after you defeat the boss or kill all the henchmen. The stadium feels bigger and emptier than when you were trying to dodge bullets. The abandoned building where you fight the high schooler samurai, she's so fucking cool, feels more abandoned the moment you stop having to worry about being sliced into pieces. The game feels rather unpolished, but not particularly in a bad way because the intention becomes clear once you look at the rest of the game. The entirety of the game dons this air of sarcastic indifference, Fourth wall-breaking jokes and dialogue can be seen littered throughout the story, and even the game's own mechanics, like the aforementioned jacking off lightsaber to refill power. All of this gives you the idea that the game knows it's a video game, but it's pretending not to know in order to humor you than the other way around. And for this reason, the entirety of the map being an odd place is perfect. These odd places bring forth into the surface the constructedness of video games. The fleeting existence I mentioned earlier? Well, what else feels more fleeting than that which is fabricated or created? And No More Heroes uses this constructedness to strengthen its air of sarcastic indifference, which is what makes it as bizarre and memorable as it is. The erratic Slovenian shitposter and Reddit troll Slavoj Žižek once used video games to highlight the uncertainty of the modern sciences. Now, keep in mind, neither me nor Žižek are quantum physicists, but the gist of his position was basically, we are still uncertain about the very basics of our material world. For the majority of the modern science's lifespans, we've regarded the atom as the unsplittable basic element. Until, of course, we did split the atom, and now we kinda don't really know the basic element of all reality, or if what this reality is actually reality, or whatever. Quantum theory and the crowd of theories that come with it are notoriously difficult for normal people to grasp easily. If you think you understand quantum mechanics, you don't understand quantum mechanics, being a very popular quote within the sphere, attributed to the American physicist Richard Feynman. Anyways, so Žižek brings up video games, especially the fact of skyboxes and invisible walls, to develop his point. Developers put up skyboxes, or the sky texture when you look up in a game, and invisible walls or textures to fake distance in order to maintain immersion. But, as Žižek says, once you get close to one of these textures, you realize that these are not really fully rendered out trees or buildings, but just pictures put there to fool you into believing that a real world exists within that screen of yours. Thus, you are made aware of the constructedness of the game. When scientists came to the conclusion that we actually cannot really come to any single all-answering conclusion for the question of what reality really is, we are also kind of stumbling upon the same constructedness of reality. If you believe in God, it's almost like God just forgot to code in the insides of the electron, thinking, hey, these square persons with 4 dangly things from each corner won't possibly look this far into things. In any case, God himself has inadvertently fallen into the same path game developers take when designing these odd places. However, a more atheist way of looking at it, perhaps a more interesting way, is that we are confronted not with the constructedness or the limitation of the universe, but the limitation of human knowledge. We cannot perceive every ray of light, nor can we hear a vast range of frequencies that are really there. And when we confront this limitation, we are confronted with the traumatic truth of uncertainty. And the feeling that results from this encounter is not only the feeling felt from experiencing these odd places, but also the real-life liminal spaces as well. Take this waterfall beside the castle in Mario 64 showcased by Annie Austin. It is rather peaceful, nothing overtly odd or strange about it. But it's empty. It is unremarkably empty. The moment you get close, you realize it's emptier than you thought when you looked at it from farther away. You realize it's not a place you were meant to think about or experience to the extent that you have. Then you're confronted with the artificiality of the place. The waterfall now reveals itself explicitly to be a texture. Why does the fence break off from its linear pattern when it reaches this specific, totally unremarkable little patch of grass? This builds dread inside you. Why? Isn't this what also happens with liminal spaces? The empty offices, abandoned parks, long hotel corridors, none of these are by themselves threatening or scary, but once you find yourself thinking about it, your mind stumbles upon their oddness. In simpler words, the strangeness you feel is the strangeness of existence itself. The fact of being there, translated Dasein, simple existence itself, is a matter of great uncertainty, and by extension, odd. Solar Pellets gives a rather special status for Anor Londo in their video, in that Anor Londo is basically the only level of the game that is virtually featured in its entirety in the video. And yeah, the architecture of Anor Londo is especially weird, with random drop-offs, extensions, and other structural oddities to be found all throughout, not to mention the sheer expanse of utter empty and unutilized space. And it isn't surprising either, considering the fact that Anor Londo especially contains this quality of constructedness because it is constructed even within the lore of the game. When we arrive at Anor Londo, the sinking sun-soaked city, what we actually witness is simply a facade created by Gwendolyn, who, like most bosses, is also desperately grasping to a tired old flame that needs to be put out. The constructedness is the very marrow of the Anor Londo we see in Dark Souls. And as such, like No More Heroes, Dark Souls 2, inadvertently or not, uses the explicit constructedness of the entire area to add to the intended strangeness of the story. In a similar vein, so does the town of Silent Hill, perhaps the game most cited as liminal. Aside from the obvious aesthetic features, the town, in all three of the first Silent Hill games, is constructed to a degree either by the cult of Silent Hill or the protagonist, or even a mixture of both. I'd argue, more than the bleeding walls of the hospital in Silent Hill 3, the spaces that really got me on the edge were the washed out and silent halls of the subway station and the fog-filled streets of Silent Hill itself. Furthermore, the fact that the weirdness is partly the result of the main character's perception of the town also adds to this weirdness as explained earlier.
They looked like monsters to you?
This utterly devastating line spoken by Vincent is chilling, especially because of the question of intention. The question, why? Were they not supposed to look like monsters? Sort of mirrors the question of, am I not supposed to be here? That pops up when experiencing these odd places. But as you can see, in both those questions, we take a subconsciously passive role, don't we? We must do what we are supposed to do. Not doing so leads to this feeling of strangeness, this encounter with the uncanny. We must do what they want us to do. In one of his seminars, psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan used a peculiar analogy to describe anxiety. You see, praying mantises are kinkier than what you may have first thought. Because of course everyone thinks about praying mantises having sex. Female praying mantises are known to commonly decapitate and cannibalize male mantises after a sexual encounter. So, Lacan tells us to imagine that we are standing in front of a female praying mantis. However, we are also wearing a mask of a mantis ourselves. Only that we're not made privy to the information of whether or not our mask is that of a male or a female. In other words, We do not know if the female mantis in front of us will kill us or not. Because we're wearing the mask, we aren't able to see the reflection coming off of the female mantis's eyes. This state of uncertainty as to how this other perceives us is what Lacan calls anxiety. This other, or the symbolic order for Lacan, is basically supposed to be the authorities that govern our lives, such as our wider sociocultural surroundings, our family and friends, the state, the law, and so on. Isn't this anxiety, also what we see in the peculiar feeling that we get when we encounter liminal spaces or these odd places in video games? We are unaware of how the game perceives us. We don't know if you're supposed to be hanging from this ledge in the original Assassin's Creed. We don't know if you're supposed to peer into the ever-expanding solid blue representing an ocean in Spyro the Dragon. We make ourselves subservient to the game's intentions for us. You've probably heard someone say, hell, maybe myself say, what makes video games a special medium of art is the factor of interaction. In video games, you have control over the actions of the characters or the direction of the flow of the story itself. So instead of a passive role of observing a story that has no bearing over your life unfold, you take an active role, helping shape the art itself come to life. While of course that is true, we must ask, do I really shape the story to my liking? What even is my liking? What even is the I? If we take Lacan's work, we get to a simple yet perhaps peculiar answer. First off, there is no I, in the sense that there is no innate or hidden entity, no authentic you inside you that comes ready-made from your birth, who already is aware of your tastes, beliefs, personality, expression, and if you want to take the Butler route, gender and sexuality, and so on. The I is more of a linguistic construct, a result of our language structure more than it is a metaphysical, existential one. You are simply what you think you are expected to be by the symbolic order. There is nothing behind the mask. And so, more than characterizing video games as a beacon of player choice and interaction, wouldn't it also be true that the video game constructs us more than we construct the video game? The development process of the game, the pre-made story, design, code, and so on, what we may describe as the symbolic order here, shape us, the player. The video game dictates our actions and choices more than the other way around. And when you look at things through this lens, these odd places and the strange feeling that arises due to them make perfect sense. When you encounter the odd place, you are acting strictly out of what is expected of you by the video game, and thus you are alienated from your self-identity constructed by the game, leaving you anxious. Here's the bit of the video essay where I showcase my smug self-awareness by pointing out the highly cliché thing I'm about to do. So here it is. Here's the bit of the video essay where I complain about capitalism. So, you know how this controversial old guy, celebrated as the best philosopher of the millennium or something, I don't know. Anyways, you know how he said in his economic manuscripts how in a capitalist economy, what matters is exchange value, not use value. In other words, capitalism commodifies. The houses, bridges, offices, schools, churches, wells, parks, and most, if not all other living spaces that we build in order to live in them or to utilize them, all just fade into this vague, immaterial categorizations of capital. Around the world, in numerous countries, we see hundreds and thousands of vacant and empty buildings being bought and sold off by realtors or stock exchange bros, while these very countries report rising homelessness. Housing crises popping up around the world, like the one we can see right now in Turkey, leaving innumerable more than livable houses and other properties totally abandoned while utilizing their exchange value, which has now taken up this ethereal, ghost-like form, haunting these very places. All that is solid melts into air. What are these spaces, if not odd and unremarkable? Under capitalism, they're no longer intended to be lived in, but exchanged and marked for the further proliferation of capital. And as we've established, these places possess a quality that fills us with a dread of shaken sense of self. They no longer suppose us to inhabit them. In a Baudrillardian way, or Baudrillard, for fuck's sake. In a Baudrillardian way, these abstract figures of exchange have replaced the material spaces themselves. The simulation has replaced the real. Now, the thing with Zizek is that he's old. So I wouldn't expect him to know the very fascinating and even liberating act of breaking out of bounds. If you've ever played an older, less polished video game, especially in a lower grade hardware, you may have accidentally stumbled over outside the very code of the video game. When I was a wee lad, I played Spider-Man 2 on my crappy 2GB RAM Toshiba laptop. And I don't mean the critically revered Spider-Man 2, but
You're supposed to fall down now, Puma. Didn't you read the script?
You're pretty good indoors.
Spider-Man 2, the game. A version I am still bewildered as to how it even exists. It is a downgrade in every sense of the word from the original, the real, Spider-Man 2. And of course, it broke quite a bit while I was playing through it. NPCs won't spawn in sometimes. Player character models would sometimes teleport into the van doing a chase mission, and sometimes you would just swing into a building and fall out of bounds through it. Of course, this is no special nor rare occurrence. Nowadays, whole communities have formed around finding ways to break through outside the confines of the intended game's code and design in order to look further into its skeletal structure and to learn what makes it tick. The popularity of the Boundary Break video series on YouTube stands as proof for how globally fascinating it is to see the hidden structures that support the games we know and love. While the odd places are places that the dev may have never expected you to think much about, the out-of-bounds areas are places that the dev never would have expected you to even experience. Thus, the act of breaking out of bounds feels less anxious and more exciting because the act itself requires active effort, unlike the odd places. And in that sense, the act of breaking out of bounds, actively choosing to break immersion, to experience the illusion head-on with the clear awareness of it being an illusion, is a rather revolutionary and transgressive act. By breaking out, we get a clearer view of how the game functions, how the game deloads faraway places and replaces them with a low poly model or sometimes even a flat image to juggle resources more efficiently. We see the smoke screens and mirrors for what they are, and by doing so, we learn of the intricate decisions that the devs may have made to run their game on your system. But this breaking out rarely ever diminishes the video game's experience, but usually enhances it. Look at Zully the Witch and how their videos peering into character models of Elden Ring has led us to know more about the otherwise unknown history of development, scrapped ideas, hidden models, and so on. Their videos have led to a greater appreciation for the design and development of Elden Ring, showcasing the intricacies that underlie the piss-colored lands. I'd argue the same thing, if only to a lesser extent, is accomplished by these odd places. By transgressing what is expected of us, by thinking more, questioning, and in the case of boundary breaking, breaking out of the surfaces, we end up with a more complete and holistic understanding of how the game ticks. This transgression, by virtue of it being a transgression of what we think is expected of us, is also a transgression of the self as well. A transgression of the supposed to. Yes, what we are left with is uncertainty and a sense of anxiety in the case of the odd places. But this strange feeling, dread, once confronted and ruminated upon, a rumination that may even result in breaking out of bounds, becomes liberating. Psychoanalysis remains radically different to other schools of thought in psychology. While these other, more widely accepted approaches usually have as their goal the return of the patient to normal society after defeating their unconscious, in that you go to a psychologist when you're feeling too sad or too happy or too whatever that has you incapable of doing like you usually do or be normal. Psychoanalysis instead wants you to be aware of your unconscious. It does not want you to suppress the id and reinstate power to the ego, but to be aware of how the symbolic order affects you, to be aware of your self's constructedness. This is indeed a very precarious position. Psychoanalysis does not leave you with a concrete solution, but with more questions. It does not let you turn to the perverse role of being a servant of the symbolic order, but has you take a hysterical position of forever questioning. This is the same hysteria we see when we encounter the odd places that lead us to a greater understanding and appreciation of video game design. And remember the whole bit about capitalism making real-life places into liminal spaces? Well, I think this transgressive, revolutionary hysteria is also what we must adopt when it comes to the vacant, commodified houses in Turkey or, well, the world. Maybe one day we will be able to break out of bounds of this decaying system that has left us tired, broken, and anxious. And frankly, I hope that day arrives soon. Thanks for watching. That's the end of the video. Thank you very much for watching. A special shout out to Key, or K-E-E, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, for becoming the first ever member in my Patreon. The link is in the description down below, so if you're interested in seeing videos about video games and philosophy and like anime or whatever, please check it out and consider joining. Once again, thank you, Key, for joining my Patreon. Follow my Twitter and other socials, all linked in the description down below. If you like this video, let me know in the comments and also consider subscribing. Once again, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.